Chapter 7. 3 weeks later, Robert's aunt, Lord's Marty, arrived in Rishikesh. From plane to train to taxi, she had been hurtling ever eastward, and for the first time in 2 days, she felt herself not in motion. She sat down next to her suitcase, took out her mirror, and saw how she was faring. She gazed at her red hair, her blue eyes, and her nose, which she considered way too sharp. Lords never liked to go any further south because she considered her mouth her worst feature. Too horsey, she thought. Her colleagues at New York Magazine had tons of suggestions for this cockamamie trip of hers. More shots, less shots, special herbs to fight airsickness. She had met all their voices of concern with the same theme. If I can hack it in New York, then India shouldn't be a problem. But India is, Lords reiterated to herself, taking out of her purse some deeply creased faxes that she straightened before her. "Dear Aunt Lords," read the first one, "I've just met this really powerful yogi." Lords must have read that first sentence about 100 times. That was her first warning that her nephew's trip might be more than she had wanted. Just a little respite during her stressful divorce proceedings with his uncle. Robert, Lords sighed, thinking of the boy. He had been more like a son to her than a nephew. When Lords' sister and husband had died in a car crash, Lords and her husband Jack had taken him in and raised him as their only child. Lords skipped to the end of the first fax. "Feels like something has taken hold of me which isn't me, but is me. Reminds me of what Uncle Jack used to say about his experiences with peyote." Damn him! Lords cursed her ex for filling Robert with all sorts of wild stories about doing magic mushrooms with Ginsberg and the other worthless beats. Lords reached for the third fax. "Baba and I have traveled to Rishikesh. There was trouble in Delhi. Had to leave that night." Once again, a phrase, the disguising use of the passive voice, "there was trouble," began to weigh on Lords' mind. She blamed herself and her nasty divorce for forcing Robert to be now seeking a new father figure. Then his letters took a new turn. "Can't believe it. One night Baba told me that someone was calling him. He went out into the night and brought back an American, Alan Hennessy, who was lost on a mountain road. Strange things like this are happening all the time." That's what decided it for Lords. She faxed Robert that she would be arriving on October 26th. He wrote back telling her to travel from Delhi to Dehradun, take a taxi there and go to Rishikesh. Once there, go to a restaurant called Chotiwala, and a porter there will help you get to the ashram. Lords had followed Robert's instructions and was now facing a large sign which proudly proclaimed the very, very best in quality, Chotiwala. Lords suddenly felt some sort of presence behind her. She turned around, and her mouth dropped open in shock. Right before her was an obese, nearly naked man whose body had been smeared with gel and then covered with hundreds of shiny sprinkles. But what truly mystified and nauseated her was his head. The man's hair had been completely shorn off except for a small circle of long hair that had been waxed so stiffly that it looked like a spike had been driven into his skull. Lords stared at the creature as he edged closer to her, his speckled folds of blubber bouncing as he moved. "Dollar," he pronounced, shooting his spongy palm at her. Lords had the presence of mind to shake her head and turn away, but the man circled around her and, with a much more insistent voice, demanded, "Dollar." Lords shook her head, crossing her arms over her chest. "Okay, euro," he replied, his speckled palm still pushing forward. "No, go away," Lords exclaimed, shooing him away as though he were an unruly dog. This finally discouraged the man. He smacked his lips and walked toward the cement steps of Chotiwala. Lords sat down as well, shaken by the incident. In the few days since Lords had come to India, she had been harassed by deformed-looking beggars, seen ash-smeared sadhus, and had grown accustomed to the scent of India, a combination of diesel fumes, dust, and curry. And yet it was this speckled specimen that truly made her realize how much she detested this country. A few minutes later, a barefoot local walked up wide-eyed to the huge speckled man, bent his forehead to the ground, and bowed to the glazed deity. Then the villager took out a tin of pudding and placed it before the sumo-sized man, who scooped it up with one glistening swipe and popped it into his mouth. "Oh, God," Lords muttered. "Keep it together, Lords. You're on a mission." But after waiting for an hour, there was still no porter, and Lords was desperate to go into the restaurant. The demigod hadn't made it any easier. He was now sprawled across the steps leading to its doors. But Lords realized she just had to go in. So she wheeled her suitcase up to the step, staring down at the demigod. "Move," she told him in her most imperious voice. For the longest time, the demigod did nothing, and just looked lazily up at her through his glistening eyelids. Then, like a huge ship riding its course, he sat up, and Lords quickly slipped through. The restaurant was empty. The walls were painted a faded blue, and the only decor was a garland of plastic flowers surrounding a man's photograph. Lords strode back to the kitchen. "Hello?" she called out. A man with a long shirt and polyester pants turned from the stove toward her. "I am Mrs. Marty. I'm looking for the porter," she said in a voice that was more like a prayer. A faint smile appeared on the man's face. "Porter?" Lords repeated, her voice rising with anxiety. "No English," the man replied. Lord shook her head and trudged back outside. But now the demigod had moved again. He was lying down, leaving just the smallest amount of room for Lords to maneuver her suitcase by him. In her job with the magazine, Lords had interviewed many of the pampered divas of Manhattan's elite. She thought of herself as being quite adept at navigating the treacherous shores of narcissism. But clearly, this glistening hulk was getting the better of her. With that thought in mind, she tortuously moved her suitcase down the steps and returned to her previous spot. She then took out an issue of Vanity Fair and tried to keep her eyes on the page, but her gaze kept rising up to see the demigod's gut rising and falling as he slept. Around noon, things started to liven up. The demigod righted himself, and people began to enter the restaurant. At the same time, a group of beggars began to gather near the restaurant's steps. They were all dressed pretty shabbily, except for one man who seemed to exude the essence of Southern California, with his tan skin, long blonde hair, and baggy shorts. Immediately he went over to Lords. "Mrs. Marty?" he inquired. Lords nodded. "I'm Bertie. Robert asked me to meet you," he said in a German accent. "Thank God," Lords exclaimed, putting her hand to her heart. "I'm so glad to meet you."